Top story this hour, the African Transformation Movement has rejected the national dialogue on coalition government, staging a walkout at the event. ATM leader Vuyo Zungula has also criticized Parliament for recently going on a study tour to Europe in order to learn about coalition government, saying it excluded smaller parties. Deputy President and leader of government business, Paul Mashatile, convened the two-day dialogue at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town.
These dialogues therefore seeks to promote fidelity to the national interest so that we remain focused on the fulfillment of our constitutional injunction, which is to build a united, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist and prosperous South Africa. You will have seen our discussion paper, ladies and gentlemen, which is entitled A Policy Framework Towards Stable Governance. It makes the important point that, and I quote, coalitions are an unmistakable expression of choices that the electorate has made. It is democracy at work, close quote. But the paper also went on to recognize and identifies some problems and challenges, particularly in the local sphere of government. Amongst them, it says lack of skills, inadequate revenue, indifference from both administrators and politicians, and the substitution of the public good with self-interest. The document also makes an important point whose nuances must be kept in mind throughout our discussions this weekend. Whereas it asserts a direct correlation between the constant collapse of municipalities or municipal executives and them being coalition governments, it also cautions that the correlation does not imply causality. That is, coalitions can trigger collapses in that both the coalitions and their turbulences have separate triggers, albeit some of them interrelated. However, ladies and gentlemen, the frequent collapse of coalitions that were witnessed at local government level sometimes is deliberate, sometimes even unrelated to the pursuit of the public good.
Well, Samkele Maseko, SABC News, a political reporter, joins us for more on this discussion. Samkele, a very good afternoon to you. Now, we've just heard in these news that the ATM has staged a walkout of these discussions. Do tell us more.
The ATM President Vuyo Zungula indeed did stage a walkout of these particular discussions on the coalition roadmap of the country and the particular bill that is being brought upon Parliament to regulate coalitions and the introduction of a threshold to replace the PR or the proportional representation system that you currently have. We've got various proposals from the ANC and from the Democratic Alliance that speak about the limiting of motions of no confidence against the executives of these particular metro municipalities and local municipalities within the country. The ANC and the DA are seemingly in cahoots and working together when it comes to the issue of the introduction of the threshold. Smaller parties like the ATM, like COPE, like the Good Party of Patricia Dillon, like the IFP, they are all against the introduction of this threshold, like Al-Jama, which basically weighs down their proportional representation within these councils with the introduction of the threshold. Basically, the ATM is saying that this is a farce, and whatever is being discussed here is of a grand coalition that is being cooked by the ANC and the Democratic Alliance.
Samkele, maybe take us back a little bit. How was the opening address? What was it about with the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile?
The opening address by the Deputy President of the country, Paul Mashatile, was outlining the role of coalition governments, outlining where South Africa is at currently at a local level, speaking of the dysfunctionalities of coalition governments, speaking of a high turnover of executive mayor within the metro municipalities in Johannesburg, in Tshwane, in Ekurhuleni, in Nelson Mandela Bay, in Gqeberha, speaking about how this needs to be curbed because it is causing instability and it is affecting service delivery across the board. And also speaking about insulating those public officials, the bureaucrats who are the heads of departments, who are the municipal managers, against the negotiations of coalition governments and insulating them from the politics of the day.
And Samkele, what can we expect going forward this weekend with the walkout of the ATM and of course with the discussion still to continue?
What we have observed is that the economic freedom fighters have boycotted this particular coalition discussion. The ATM has walked out. Other political formations, Al-Jamaa, UDM, COPE, we've seen Busa of Musimaimani, we've seen Rise Mzansi, led by the likes of Magashule Ghana. We've also seen other political formations in this particular discussion. The Congress of the People, they have all stated they are in deliberations. What has just transpired now is that the UDM leader, Bantu Holomisa, has been pretty much shocked that there has already been a draft bill that is going to be circulated within Parliament to the members of Parliament to deliberate upon. But upon Paul Mashatile's election as the Deputy President of the country, he then instructed those who were bringing that particular draft bill on the regulations of the coalitions to halt it and then wait for him to have this particular national coalition dialogue that is currently taking place now and will ultimately conclude tomorrow afternoon.
And Samkele, maybe tell us more about this regulation bill. What is the Deputy President saying it's going to entail?
What we do know is that it entails the issues pertaining to the thresholds that are being introduced by the two big parties, the issues of regulating motions of no confidence, and also amending the Municipal Structures Act, in particular Section 25 of that particular Municipal Structures Act, which speaks to the issue of thresholds, which speaks to the issue of proportional representation. And for any party, they must meet a certain threshold of vote percentage being voted for upon those municipal elections in order for them to be allocated a certain number of seats. It basically empowers the bigger political parties like the ANC, like the Democratic Alliance, who are dominant in certain areas, to have first preference in the constitution of local governments within those municipalities in a particular period of time. We've heard the proposal by the Democratic Alliance that should there be a hung council, that hung council has 30 days for parties to negotiate to constitute a government, failing which it then dissolves, or the opportunity is given to other political formations to try and form a coalition government. The ANC goes further to propose that should there be no outright winner of 50+1, then the executive mayoral system must then kick in, which is that executive system that is currently being used in eThekwini, as opposed to the executive mayor system that you currently have in Johannesburg. You have an electoral committee system that is currently being rolled out by a municipality like eThekwini in order for the political parties to be represented at that executive committee level, as opposed to having an executive mayoral system like we have with the executive mayor of Tshwane, executive mayor of Johannesburg.
All right, we're going to leave it there. That is SABC political reporter there, Samkele Maseko. Well, will this weekend's national dialogue on coalition governments avoid the pitfall of over-regulation in favor of prudence? Well, that is the question for Mr. Ibrahim Fakir, who is the Awal Socio-Economic Research Institute Director of Programs, who joins us now to unpack this. Mr. Fakir, very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Interesting question. What do you foresee as the outcomes from this weekend's proceedings? We've just heard that, of course, the ATM has just staged a walkout, citing that these talks are, of course, very, very premature.
Well, that's the one thing I can say that could be predicted, because the ATM is, like other parties, a destabilizing or kind of sore loser kind of party. You know, it's a spoiler party. It's there to spoil things and make spurious allegations. Now, while that may, on the face of it, seem legitimate, and they may, however, have a point in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of discussion taking place But there's equally a lot of confusion over those discussions. So when the question of a threshold is put out, just for example, by way of example, the conflation is always made that, if you put in a threshold, does the threshold apply only to representation in a legislature or a council, or must the threshold apply only to the formation of government? Mm-hmm. Now, people argue differently. My argument, for example, is that you should not have no threshold for inclusion in a representative institution, such as parliament or a local council, or municipal council, or provincial legislature. Mm-hmm. You get the required number of votes. We'd have a natural threshold as it is built into this normal PR system or this proportional representation system. You take up your seat. But if you want to be part of government and you want to stabilize government, then you must be a party which has a sizable constituency of support, which is demonstrable through the support that you show. So if you don't reach, for example, hypothetically 5% or 10%, I've argued for something higher, but let's just take those 5 or 10% as the modest amount. Mm-hmm. If you don't achieve that as a party, why should you warrant being in government? Surely you don't have a sizable constituency of support. You're not demonstrating a major amount of support. You are demonstrating support. It's niche support. Yes, you're not being excluded from being represented in a legislature, but you are precluded from forming government, because what happens in those instances is that the smaller parties, as you see in Joburg, Otwane or Nelson Mandela Bay historically, minuscule, what are technically called rats and mice parties, and I'm not being pejorative, that's a technical term for these very small parties, they wield an inordinate and extraordinary amount of influence that they don't actually merit. And that causes major instability in government, right? So you can't have it both ways. If you want stability in government, you have to choose a prudent level at which parties which have a modicum of demonstrable support have the potential for inclusion. Of course, whereas there's a clear majority, that's fine. The second thing is, a lot of this is, it's political, right? But what's going on here is politics in a very crude sense. And what I mean by that is that each party is going to argue only for what in its short-term interests. Yes. So those parties which are saying, no, we must be given the first option, or we must distribute portfolios proportionately, for example. That the Municipal Systems and the Structures Act already creates the opportunity for the MEC, for local government at provincial level, to tell metro councils or executives within its jurisdiction what system they can use or should use, and issue a directive in that regard. Yet, because it doesn't serve that political party's interests, they have not done so. You need not have had the instability in Johannesburg or Tshwane had the MEC, provincial and local government, issued a directive of that nature. They didn't, because it didn't suit their political interests. So, Mr. Fakir, the long and short, yes.
Yes, sir. Just to jump in there, in the interest of time, while we're speaking about this threshold and representation, interestingly enough, yesterday the spokesperson for the ruling party, Mahlengu Motsiri, released a statement yesterday saying that, and I quote, whoever has the most votes should actually be the one that leads the coalitions. Doesn't this then defeat the sole purpose of coalitions, where one party still yields all the decision-making powers within that structure?
Well, in part, yes, but one can understand why that party is making that suggestion. So, for example, the DA would make the same suggestion where it has the majority of votes in a council or in a legislature, right? So each party which will have a commanding majority or the most number of votes, because they don't have a clear majority, will say, no, we should take a lead. Then you got to ask them, okay, if you are so genuine about being inclusive, will you include the second largest party? Will you distribute a executive portfolio to them? In that case, they will say no. But of course, if you believe that there should be proportionate distribution of portfolios, none of the parties have actually abided by that kind of dictum or principle, firstly. Secondly, if they believe that that is the way they would like to go, then the proof of the pudding is on the eating. The third, however, and this is where we would look to in the future, if you give the opportunity to the largest party, it is possible that they will then go to seek out partners elsewhere. And then the likelihood is they'll find one or two, depending on the nature of percentage support that they got.
All right.
And they cobble together a coalition with 2 or 3 parties. It's easily manageable. But the real solution is fundamental electoral reform. Any reform now is going to be a bit reform.
All right. Mr. Fakir, unfortunately, we've run out of time for this interview. Thank you so much for joining us. That is Mr. Ibrahim Fakir of the Awal Socioeconomic Research Institute. He's the Director of Programs there, and he was weighing on the coalitions.